continuing our journey into through static budgets, and now we're looking at something called flexible budgets. Because again, a static budget just looks at one specific production level, and so it doesn't take into consideration that different levels of production may occur during a period of time. So basically, we create something called a flexible budget, which is basically a whole series of static budgets. So who says being static isn't so bad? You can be flexible and static, apparently. You just need to have a lot more static. So we're going to be looking at what happens when we have different levels of activity, and how things change, right? Because it doesn't make any sense to compare a static budget of, say, 10,000 units with an actual budget of 12,000 units. This doesn't make any sense, because how can you compare that? You thought you were going to make 10,000, you ended up making 12,000. So why are you comparing it to the 10? So this is what the idea of flexible budgets comes in. It gives us varying levels to look at based on the activity level we've actually reached. So here we go. Woo! Here's an illustration. Barton Robotics. They have a static budget listed here from their assembly department based on 10,000 units. Okay, and so based on 10,000 units, they have the following budgeted costs for indirect materials, indirect labor, utilities, depreciation, property taxes, and supervision. $1.1 million for 10,000 units. Okay. Well, like I said, what if they actually made more than that? Well, in this case, they did. They actually produced 12,000 units compared to the 10,000 that they actually budgeted for. So when you actually do the report here, clearly it's not going to look very good because you produced a lot more units than you budgeted for. So if you use this type of a form and you stuck with your budgeted 10,000 units, clearly you have gone over in indirect materials, you have gone over budget in indirect labor, you've gone over budget in utility use, okay? So that clearly creates an unfavorable report. It looks like you've overspent by 132,000. Well, again, that would be true if you actually created 10,000 units and not 12,000. But because you actually created 12,000, comparing it to a budget for 10,000 doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's not really very helpful. So thus, we have to create more than one static budget, right? So we can compare things properly. When you looked at the last budget, it looks like it's horrible. 12% over budget, 132,000 over, not very good. But you're comparing 12,000 units that you actually produced with data for 10. So it's not relevant. It's really quite meaningless. You can't really use it. So we really need to start using multiple static budgets at various production levels. So using a static budget for 10,000 doesn't work when you've produced 12,000. So what do we do? Well, we have to look at our variable costs per unit, so we can actually calculate properly for the 12,000 that we've done. So here we have, when you look at the budget data that we made for 10,000 units, we budgeted $250,000 for indirect materials to create 10,000 units. So that's $25 per unit in indirect materials. We budgeted $260,000 in indirect labor to make 10,000 units. That's $26 per unit. And we budgeted 190,000 in utilities for 10,000 units, which is $19 per unit. So in other words, we had a per unit cost in these variable overhead costs of $70 per unit. Okay. So what you need to do is create a budget, then knowing your per unit cost, and your original budget was for 10,000, you need to create a new one for 12,000. So once you do that, your indirect materials budgets for 12,000 would have been $300,000, not 250, 300,000. Your budget for indirect labor would have been 312,000. Your budget for utilities would have been 228,000. Right. So that would have been, these numbers would have needed to replace the original ones that you had for your $10,000 unit budget. So now we stick that in our budget. Okay. For 12,000 units, we are going to have indirect materials budgeted at 300,000, which is what we calculated in the last slide. We actually spent 295. We spent less than what we budgeted for based on 12,000. Look, the budget is for 12,000. The actual. Now it makes sense to compare. And clearly we did better, right? It's favorable because it's under budget by 5,000. Labor was perfect. We didn't make any mistakes there. We budgeted 312. It cost 312, no problems. We were on target with our budget. Utilities, we would have needed to budget 228. We only used 225. That's also favorable. We had $3,000 less in utility expenses than we thought. So total variable costs, we budgeted 840. We only spent 832. So in actuality, we had an $8,000 favorable difference when it comes to that. So in essence, this was well worth our while. Excuse me. Because when your budget is for 12,000 and you actually produce 12,000, now you can compare things better. Now this makes a difference. This is relevant. And clearly we did really, really well in our indirect materials and utilities. We saved $8,000 in the process. Labor was on target, no problem. So this is better because now we can compare a budget of 12,000 units with an actual cost for the 12,000 units. Rather than going by the one static budget of 10,000, we actually created one for 12,000. This is a flexible budget. Okay. So developing the flexible budget basically looks at, I'm sorry. Okay. Something came up on my screen. I'm not sure if you saw it. Requires you to identify the activity index at play here. And what's a relevant range of activity? So if you budget for 10,000, it's quite possible you could have been short, maybe 8,000 or higher, maybe 12,000, maybe that's a relevant range. So based on the relevant range, that's the amount of static budgets you have to create. So you have, in essence, a flexible budget. Okay. You have to identify those variable costs, and basically speaking, that needs to be part of this budget process. Identify the fixed costs. Usually, in case the fixed costs are not going to be changing with levels of activity all that much. A few might, but for the most part, it usually affects just the variable costs, not so much the fixed costs. Well, there are those exceptions. And then you just prepare a budget for those increments of activity, okay, based on the relevant range. So, for example, if you had Fox Company here, they use a flexible budget for their monthly comparisons when they look at actual and budgeted manufacturing overhead costs for their finishing department. Okay. So the master budget shows the annual expected operating capacity of 120,000 direct labor hours at the following costs. So here we have variable costs, indirect materials, indirect labor, utilities, total variable of 480, fixed costs, depreciation, supervision, property taxes, total of 360. So remember, we're going to use that 120 direct labor hours as a marker to get the variable cost per labor hour here. Okay. So 4 steps to identify and develop this budget. Your activity. So in this case, the activity is, we're going to be basing it on direct labor hours. The relevant range, we're going to use a relevant range as few as 8,000 hours to as much as 12,000 direct labor hours for the month. So we need to create static budgets for these ranges. So the second thing is we identify those variable costs and determine the per unit cost. So the variable costs are given to us as indirect materials, indirect labor, and utilities. We already know we're using 120,000 direct labor hours. So when we divide these numbers, we get $1.50 for indirect materials per labor hour, $2 of indirect labor per labor hour, 50 cents of utility cost per labor hour, or a total of $4 in total variable costs per labor hour. Third step is to identify those fixed costs. And so we have, in this case, from the previous slide, 2 slides ago, we have 3 fixed costs that were given to us: depreciation, supervision, and property taxes. These are not going to change for the month. So no problems there. And then we prepare the budget. We're going to be preparing the budget in increments of 1,000 direct labor hours. So again, we'll start, the low end is 8,000, the high end is 12,000. So we're going to create those 5 budgets. So here we go. For 8,000 direct labor hours, 9,000, 10,000, 11,000, 12,000. Those are the 5 columns that represent each of these flexible budgets. These are 5 different static budgets that in and of itself, when you put them all together, create a flexible budget. Variable costs, this is what we had to break down, right? $1.50 per hour, $2 per hour in indirect labor, 50 cents per hour for utilities. Just multiply it for each, add them up. What we got here is 32,000 in total variable costs if we work the 8,000 hours. Fixed costs do not change. So total costs are 62,000 at 8,000 hours. At 9,000 hours, we would have variable costs of 36,000 and total costs of 66. At 10,000 hours, our variable costs would be 40,000. Total costs are 70. For 11,000 hours, we would have variable costs at 44,000, total cost of 74. And at 12,000 hours, our variable costs are 48 grand and our total costs are 70. So that's what we need to know, okay, before we can actually determine, which one we're going to be using to compare how we did. So here, this company uses the formula below to determine its total budgeted costs at any level of activity. They take their fixed costs and they add Their variable cost, and there's a little asterisk indicating that it's the variable cost per unit times the activity number of units. That's the total budgeted costs. So determine then the total budgeted cost for Fox Manufacturing when they have fixed costs of $30,000 and variable costs of $4 per direct labor hour. Okay. First thing they want you to do is at 9,000 direct labor hours, and then at 8,622 direct labor hours. So again, it's the fixed costs, $30,000. That's this number right here. Plus the variable costs, which are the direct labor hours times the variable cost per direct labor hour. And so your total 66,000 is your total budgeted costs at 9,000 direct labor hours. At 8,622, right, it'd be a little bit lower. The 30,000 is still your fixed cost. Your fixed cost is still the same. The only thing that's going to be changing is you're multiplying your variable cost per hour times the number of hours. So there we go, 64,488. So what happens here, and this is, I hate to get graphic with you here, but you're old enough to handle it. In this case here, we have our total budgeted fixed costs are $30,000, regardless of how many labor hours we work, 2, 6, 10, 14, doesn't really matter. Those budgeted fixed costs are the same, regardless of activity level. However, as you see, the variable costs would change a lot based on the number of labor hours. The more labor hours we would work, clearly we would have an increase in the amount of variable costs. When you add the budgeted fixed costs to the budgeted variable costs, that's your total. Okay. Everything is based, in this case, on this graph, based on direct labor hours. Okay. So flexible budgets are widely used. They are an internal report. They're a way to look at production and costs. And also, these are used oftentimes to evaluate the managers, okay, who are in charge of these areas. So here we have the finishing department's budget. The budgeted at 9,000 direct labor hours is listed in the first column here. And then here are the actual costs at 9,000 direct labor hours. So as you see, they budgeted $13,500 for indirect materials. They actually spent $14,000. That's $500 over. So that's an unfavorable line. However, their indirect labor, they budgeted 18,000. They only spent 17,000. They saved 1,000 or $1,000 underneath their budget, which is why it's favorable. And their utilities they cost them slightly more than they budgeted for, so that's unfavorable. But when you look at all of the total costs together, these three combined, it still ended up being favorable by 400. So in essence, since the fixed costs don't change regardless, the total cost of this particular project for the finishing department was favorable by 400. So that's good because at least the manager knows he is not or she is not finished. Okay, I think I need another drink. All right, so here we have just a general question here. At 9,000 direct labor hours, you got the flexible budget for indirect material is 27 grand. If 28,000 of indirect material costs are incurred at 9,200 direct labor hours, what would the flexible budget report? Well, in this case, you would have the direct labor hour would be 3, if I'm not right. So 27,000 times divided by 9,000 hours gives you $3 in direct per hour. Is that correct? And we actually had 9,200 times 3. So that's $27,600 would be their budget. We actually spent 28,000. So we're $400 over, which is why it's $400 unfavorable. Okay. And here is where we are going to end today in our do it exercise. And I hate for you to be so graphic here, but again, try to be flexible. So what you see here is Straussel Company's flexible budget graph. The fixed cost line and the total budgeted cost line intersect at $36,000. Costs here. Total budgeted costs, 186,000 at an activity level of 50. Compute the budgeted costs at 30. Okay. So in this case here, we have got, turning over. Here, what we've got is 36,000 fixed costs, 36,000 variable costs would be the difference, right? So 186,000 is total minus your 36,000 for fixed. The rest is all variable. So 186 minus 36 will give you 100, sorry. I had a plus sign instead. That's $150,000 for 50,000 hours. So that means that it's $3 an hour for variable costs. And so here you have 30,000 direct labor hours. And so 30,000 times 3 is 90,000 plus your fixed costs, which would be 100 and, it did it right here, and I'm doing it all in my head like an idiot. So the total budgeted cost would be the $90,000 in variable plus the 36,000 in fixed. And there's your total. And here I'm breaking out the calculator like an idiot. So this is how flexible budgets are used. Again, it's a series of static budgets, so there's a lot of calculations that we have to do, but it's not very difficult, as you see. So this is where I'd like to stop.